very, very excited to be here having this discussion about Flipside and the life and times of Chris Wilcha, who is going to be joined by his editor and also producer, writer on it as well, which is really will be really interesting to talk about. Joe Beshenkovsky, did I bungle your pronunciation there? Yep.
Right.
In the ballpark? Okay, good.
Yeah.
Um, so, I related to this film on so many levels, being a filmmaker who's done a number of personal documentaries. And it was really, really interesting to me because so often when we do press kits for our films, we have a thing called the director's statement, where we talk about how the film came to be. And it occurred to me that this is sort of one big director's statement that pretty much, ends with how the film came to be. It's all one big, how the film came to be.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Yeah, please.
Very funny you say that because when we got into our first film festival, one of the first tasks was you're supposed to write a director's statement. And I was absolutely paralyzed because it just felt like redundancy. I kept thinking, am I just summarizing the thing that you're just watching? And I actually did not end up doing one. So I totally relate to that assessment. Thank you.
Well, in that vein, I kind of want to start with a scene that kind of summarized the film for me in
Yeah.
many ways, both stylistically and, where you're hitting the subject matter, but doing so in a really subtle way, I thought. And that's the scene with Uncle Floyd, David Bowie singing the Uncle Floyd song,
Yeah.
Slip Away. Um, in your narration, you say in 2002, David Bowie was 55 years old, and like most of us, taking stock of his life and career. Slip Away is a parable about art and fame, memory and mortality, about the role chance plays in the artist's life, and the hard reality that very few of us end up where we wanted or expected. Uncle Floyd calls the song an artistic time machine, but he's kind of talking about your film too. And so I wanted to know where you started with this film. What was your, you get to that kind of statement about it, oftentimes in the editing, when you're
Yeah.
sort of feeling your way through the film and you kind of you go into a film with an idea of what it is, and then in the process of editing, you're rewriting, you're kind of coming to it. So I realize I'm almost starting at the end, working backwards, but where did you know of the Bowie clip? At what point did you know of that, know how it tied into Uncle Floyd, and realize that this was kind of talking about what you were hoping to do?
Um, wow. There's a lot there. I mean, I
Yes.
think if I'm being specific about the Bowie thing, I had just, again, like many people on this call, I'm sure, I just had an instinct about stuff and I follow it and try to start shooting, right? And I'm not, there was a point at which I would wait around for permission or I would try to get some grant or I would try to sell something. And I just found it sort of paralyzing. And so I just would always go and start shooting. Um, and there was this moment, and it's true as it's represented in the movie, which is I was on a commercial job in New York City, feeling a little bit of despair about how I was making a living. And one of the beauties of commercial work is you can sometimes take advantage of the fat, the sort of excess of it. And there was a camera package that was going to, we had for the weekend, but was going to be sitting idle. And so I asked some of my friends who were on the crew if they would come out and we could go shoot at this record store that I had worked at when I was in high school. And I think the original intention, it was just that pull to document something that's going to disappear, to go revisit something that meant something. And I did not go in with a specific mission. I think maybe at most I thought, oh, maybe I'll make a little YouTube eulogy. I'll make a 3-minute sort of homage to this place that meant something to me. But when I was there, I was like, oh my God, there's so much going on here. This place is stopped in time, but Dan is, this small business owner who's just not adapting to the way things are going. And then I remembered that there was so many characters that populated the record store. Um, and that, you know, after that day, I said, I have to return here and keep shooting. And it was in the shooting. So, Uncle Floyd was somebody who, and I don't know if anyone on this Zoom remembers Uncle Floyd, but he was this, cable access kind of tri-state area icon. I mean, I think a lot of people knew him and would watch him, but he was not famous in any sense of the word. Um, but I remembered he used to shop at the record store, and he was famous to me back then when I was 16 or 17 and working at the record store, because I used to see him on this cable access show, and then he'd show up and buy records for his he had radio shows over the years. Um anyway, I asked if I could interview him, and then I got him back a couple of times to do stuff for us. And it was in that conversation in the research that I sort of shook loose the Bowie story. So by no means did I know that the Bowie story was going to be sort of thematically summarizing and compressing a lot of the sort of themes and ideas of the film, but it felt like a really remarkable discovery that David Bowie had also watched Uncle Floyd. In fact, he says, and I've uncovered other things, he says it in the voice in his introduction. I don't know if you hear it, but him and John Lennon and Iggy Pop used to get super high and watch Uncle Floyd and literally fall down on the ground laughing. I mean, this is what he was saying. Um, and then I've since read that that song might obliquely actually be about Iggy Pop and their friendship, but I'm not totally sure about that. I haven't been able to totally fact check it. And then, so I'll just say, to answer your question in an incredibly long-winded way, the film was made in the making. There were no preconceived anythings. It was all doing and going and trying and experiments and giving things to Joe to try, and Joe would shape something and then we'd rewrite it and work on it. And it was in the making that the thing got made. You know what I mean? There was very little preconceived. And this went on for years. It was, footage that I had collected over a very long period of time. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that was a kind of long-winded way of
It gets at it. There's so many aspects to the question. So I think we'll spend the whole hour and a half talking about that. Although I want to remind folks that we'll try and make room in the last half hour for you guys to pop on and ask your own questions. So this is an unusual way of working because most directors don't have the kind of relationship with an editor where I can just, throw my material and they can kind of do something with it, and together we can kind of figure out what we have on our hands here. So, yeah, I'd like to talk about the nature of your collaboration. It goes way back, right? Does it go back to This American Life?
That's where we
Yeah,
met.
yeah. I'll just say really quickly. Yes, Joe and I got involved with doing a TV adaptation of This American Life, and it started as a kind of, we're going to do a test tape and see if this is viable, and then we got a green light to do it. And it was in working on that through the production company that we had partnered with called Left Right, that I met Joe. He was an old friend of everyone there. And I want to let Joe talk, but we didn't Joe didn't work on this over this extended 10-year period. We ended up finding a compressed period of time in which we made the film. So we can talk a little bit about that. But Joe, please.
Yeah, I mean, the nature of this is that I remember in fits and starts, Chris would send me stuff like I didn't. He would just be shooting individual things. So like the Starly Kime thing, I remember screening that back in 2015 or something like that. And
Yes.
then the Ira Dance thing he sent to me, I don't know, 2019. I don't know
Yeah,
what it
maybe
was. So
18 maybe.
I would see these things, and I remember having a very visceral reaction to the Starley thing, much like maybe people had to this film. But watching that, I remember my reaction was like, "Oh shit, I need to get off my ass and do something," because her paralysis freaked me out. Um, but yeah, in fits and starts, I would see stuff. It was never about making a film or anything like that. It was just Chris sharing material. Um, and I think Chris was actively trying to get things cut, and he had editors he worked with in the commercial space. I think the issue with that is that you're always trying to steal time, and people need to prioritize work, that type of thing. He made a pitch tape. He was trying to shop it to people and spark some interest, which was impossibly hard with a film like this. And I remember we were on a phone call, and I think, I think the decision was like, we just have to make it. And maybe what sparked the whole thing is that Chris asked me as a favor. He was like, "Hey, I have this Uncle Floyd thing. Can you spend like a few days trying to throw it together?" And so I did. And I think that what you see in the film is essentially what I cut. And that, I think, was kind of the spark that motivated this idea to make the movie.
Well, you say that's what's in the cut, but did it have the same narration to it? Was it a different narration? Because it seems like the narration is what tied it together. And
I mean,
the
well,
process of writing the narration is kind of a fascinating one. Which comes first, the chicken or the egg or something?
there were tweaks, of course, but I mean, it's, most of it is expository narration, and until you get to the Bowie stuff, that obviously changed. And it was one pod, which we broke up later in the film, and there was additional material shot. But I mean, my memory of it was that we did this thing, and I think that got Chris really excited. And it's when you do it piecemeal, it's very hard. To the extent that when we decided to get together and do this, Chris put us all on a phone call, and he said, "I want to do this thing. Will you join with me and do this?" And he has people on the production end that he works with who assisted him on that side. And then I have a situation on my end where we do the post. The thing I do have to mention is that there was another editor who's a Claire Liavalant. Is that the right pronunciation?
Ave Lamont.
Yeah, more complicated name than mine somehow. And we brought her on to start the film. So I was working on this George Carlin thing. And I knew that we had to dedicate somebody to it for a fixed amount of time. And so she came on to do that, and she worked on it for several months with Chris, and we kind of all talked about structure and try and build things. And so she was trying to hash through this mountain of material to try and parse it down and give it some sense of shape. And then I came on after I wrapped Carlin. I jumped on and started moving through it again.
So Chris, when did it take a turn from looking at Uncle Floyd and seeing something in this thing with Uncle Floyd to taking such a personal turn and being really about your attempts to balance, the artist's life, as it were, with, making documentaries, with your responsibilities to your family, and am I a sellout or not a sellout, and where did that come into play?
Well, maybe I should clarify the timeline of what happened and what Joe's sort of saying, which is, so I was just collecting this documentary material over many years. I'd make a run at things, and as I say in the film, things would fall apart for different reasons. Sometimes lack of creative will, or your access would fall apart, or someone just wasn't interested in following through anymore. And so I had all of these unfinished projects. And it was, I think it was like mid-pandemic, maybe early pandemic, when I had sort of, Joe had helped me out with this little Uncle Floyd sort of chunk. And it was then that we got a group of people on a phone call that I've worked with before, a couple of producers and Joe and his crew. And we sort of said, let's make this thing, right? Like, let's just make the damn thing. Because I had tried to pitch it, and I think a lot of people just couldn't understand or visualize what it was going to be, this kind of essay documentary. They just couldn't, it was like, it was one of those things that you just had to make it. Um, and so it was when Joe and everyone I was working with said, we are going to do this, and we're going to actually put in some of our own money and our own sweat equity and time and energy. That's when we really started to work on it. And that's when I was, I was sort of shoveling archival material at this editor, Claire, and she was being overseen by Joe. And that's when we started sort of propping things up. And I think what I was doing is, I was putting in material that still felt like it had life to it. So like that Ira Glass section, that was in no way a standalone documentary. And I don't think a Flipside record store documentary was a standalone documentary, but the thought and the Herman Leonard material on it, if people watched, that had there was a limit to what was there. We knew that it wasn't a full-length film or even a totally viable short film, but the question was, if we weave these things together, if we braid these things together, might they be able to carry a lot of these themes and accumulate in an interesting and compelling way? And so what happened, one breakthrough that Joe had is we would often edit these things as a standalone chunk. Like for instance, a whole Uncle Floyd thing. And it was when Joe started breaking them in half and juxtaposing them next to other things, and the idea that characters could recur throughout and voices could return. And it wasn't just a series of standalone documentaries, but rather this entwined, thematically related, that there would be echoes between what I was saying and what they were saying, and that all this chorus of voices could sort of help carry the film forward. That was kind of an editorial breakthrough, is when we started to really experiment with the structure, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So again, not sure if I answered your question, but and that all happened. I mean, this was like, a really concentrated year. And everyone was juggling other things. Joe had other stuff going on. No one was working on it full time, which is always the trickiest thing. And I'm sure many documentary filmmakers on this Zoom can relate.
Yes. Yes, we can. So what were like the main themes that you felt the film was going to deal with entering into this? Because even those things can change in the course of editing. What did you set out to kind of get at?
Well, I would love Joe to weigh in here too, but I think creative failure was a huge one. I think sort of reflecting on who you were at 25 and who you thought you were going to be at 50, and then who you end up being, and sort of looking back at that time period. I think also figuring out one funny thematic thing that it's sort of playful but was very meaningful to me was this idea of the closet in my childhood bedroom. The idea that you were interrogating all of this stuff and you were trying to decide what to purge and leave behind and what to carry with you and what had value. And that was almost like a little conceptual engine for the whole film, which is like interrogating ideas and saying, what are things that are still relevant and meaningful to me to carry into this next phase of my life? And what are the things I need to shed, the sort of youthful notions of selling out and all that kind of stuff. And I think that became a little bit of an algorithm in the film too, which is trying to figure out, what do you take with you and what do you leave behind? And what's worth saving and what's worth keeping. And I think that was part of the record store metaphor, of Flipside itself. Like, I had this kind of funny instinct to try to save it, but, I don't think Dan particularly wanted to be saved, and maybe it shouldn't be saved. Maybe it needs to sort of, it needs to sort of diminish at its own pace, and it doesn't need my intervention, if that makes sense. So,
Yeah.
and then the beauty of doing something like this is just so many things would stick to it, right? So once you start making something, I think we've all had this creative experience, which is that all of a sudden it starts to grow and connections start to get made. You start seeing things about family. And, it seemed there was a point at which I was really very reluctant how much I would appear. And I think that there came a point where we shared it with some people for the first time where it was like, no, 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 you need to be in it more. Like you've been too conservative. You're not saying enough about your family or your feelings about work. And those were all calibrations and adjustments that got made as we were going. Like some of them were nascent themes that then we would sort of tease out in a bigger way, if that makes sense. Um, so yeah, Joe, please, I didn't mean to hijack the conversation, but
I mean, there obviously it's playing with a lot of different ideas. I think fundamentally for me it was this kind of an exploration of how to be an artist in this kind of in this climate, in this world. You know, you have kids, you have responsibilities, and how can you do the things that you want to do? And all these people are kind of grappling with that. You have I think the heart of the film is kind of, I think Herman is kind of the heart of the film, and and he's talking about a lot of these themes, but then each of the people that we touch on are dealing with it in different ways. You know, on some level, like the way I viewed Floyd, not Floyd, but Dan, who owns the record store, he's like the true artist of the film. He makes all the sacrifices. He says, I'm not going to have kids because it's going to get in the way of this thing I want to do. He's living his life exactly the way he wants to do it. But everybody else is making concessions, or they're sacrificing family in favor of their art, or they're sacrificing their marriage in favor of their art. And I think these are questions that we all deal with. And then we also all have things that we abandon. There are a lot of people that wanted to write that book and they haven't done it because they have their day job and they just can't. So, you know, the thing we talked about is that when the film is over and it cuts to credits, the next morning people wake up and they get up an hour earlier and they start typing in their laptop and they start working on that thing that they hadn't done. Like that's the feeling I personally wanted to leave everybody with, was kind of this urge to go do that thing.
Yeah. I was really struck by the scene where where you're selling your collection of records to the other Dan,
yeah,
and the contrast and how, you know, transactional that was. You know, there was something about the expression on the faces of the two guys in the store. You know, they know that's a gold mine they're getting
yeah,
from you, and they're like instantly calculating the price, as opposed to the other Dan who would like probably never sell it because he's
yeah, yeah.
busy
It's
playing
very
it.
unsentimental. Yeah, the whole
Yeah,
experience.
yeah. Um, so here's the question for you. Once it started taking this more personal turn, and people are saying you got to be in it more. How'd your wife feel about that? How did she feel about both being in it somewhat and having it even tangentially about her and the family? And how much of it did you show her while you were making it? Or how much was just a happy surprise at the end?
Yeah. You know, it's a funny question, and I actually think I overcorrected with her participation. And this is just me being personal and super honest, which is I think I was so concerned about she doesn't love when I throw the camera up and I'm shooting things, and it's just not her favorite instinct of mine. But she endures it. Um and honestly, I look at the film now and I sort of miss her voice. I kind of wish I had her participate in a little bit more, because she's sort of obliquely there. She doesn't really talk a lot. And I think that was just me out of an overabundance of concern of not wanting her to kind of, feel she was misrepresented, or feel that her voice was sort of used in a way that just didn't feel authentic or specific. I don't know. It's funny. I look back at it now and I almost wish she had made one or two more appearances verbally. She just had more to say. But I think it was me being overprotective, perhaps. Um, so, but the family stuff, I mean, I now realize that, yeah, I was just nervous. I mean, again, you guys know, like these things can go into a bad navel gazing place, and it's a kind of dangerous equation, right? Is how much of that any film can sort of stand. And I feel like we were constantly trying to find the balance between me as the narrator providing context or reflection or some sort of, insight or thought, and then just me being, maybe too much of a presence or just balancing that constantly. So yeah, it was a question, but and so just to finish the thought, I just didn't show it to her till the end. Literally, she saw it for the first time at a friends and family screening, and I think she was really moved, and I felt, and I do have a sense of like, I think I might have overcorrected on my protectiveness of her. I think she could have, I kind of wish maybe she had a little bit more of a presence in it, but
Yeah. I relate in the sense that, one of the ironies of making a personal documentary is, if your spouse is not in the industry,
yeah,
they don't want to hear about it. They just don't want to hear
yeah,
about the grind of trying to, shape this very personal story. It's like,
yeah.
you know, thanks, can you pick up milk on the way home? Uh, um, but you did get your kids being appropriately snarky, so that was
Yeah,
good.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I mean, there's just enough. And what's funny is it's also, again, one of my favorite earliest things about documentary that I was just obsessed with was that it would document things that were disappearing or changing, and I always loved documentaries that had that sort of time element. Like my mind goes to like Same River Twice, like the Rob Moss documentary, where
Mhm.
it's like here we are as these stunning specimens at age whatever 20 or 19 or and shot on 16 millimeter film, and then cut to us in our adult lives and seeing what we've endured and what has happened and the ravages of time and all of that kind of stuff. And already the film feels totally stopped in time. Like my daughter's now at college, and every it was such a snapshot of a moment in time, and it's
Yeah,
a year or two ago that it felt that way. So
yeah.
I
So many people still think of my daughter's 18, and ask about, she's still with that boyfriend, and she's 35, and no, it's another boyfriend.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
so, getting at this aspect of time, and getting back to, you know, the Uncle Floyd comment about artistic time machine,
yeah,
which in a sense, the film is. Your first film, The Target Shoots First, was also, you're a first person film. It wasn't
yeah,
quite as personal, but it was a first person film
yeah.
about you wrestling with, the idea of selling out. So what, here you are, a little over 25 years later,
Yeah.
wrestling with another personal doc. How did all the experience you had as a filmmaker um, impact, making this one? How is this different from the process of making the first one?
Hmm. Wow. Well, one thing that I think I came to love and realize about filmmaking is that it's collaborative, and that I really love that. I don't love sitting alone with a blinking cursor or trying to edit something myself. I love collaborating. I love Joe throwing, pu- cutting something and getting to look at it and respond to it and decide why I love it or hate it, or you know what I mean? Like and I think that the first thing I made was very handmade, had no idea what I was doing, was just bumbling through the process of making something. And I think now I realize that I really appreciated having help doing stuff, right? So I also had a collaborator named Adam Goldman who helped with the voiceover. We would sit in a Google Doc and talk through the ideas. What am I trying to say? What is this idea? What am I saying about family? Like throwing sentences back and forth in real time. Like I just really, I think now know that I really value other people's expertise and other people's insights and perspective. And I think in a film like this in particular, because in the time period between the Target Shoots First and now, I've done other stuff that is more like work, right? It was more just objective work for hire. And this was so personal that like I think it was people like Joe and Adam and others. Um, I would hate something because it was me, right? Or it was my family. And I would be like, I hate this footage or I hate this moment. And they'd be like, you're crazy. You have to include that. like yes, maybe it's mortifying for you, but it's important to help tell this part of the story, right? And I think that I needed collaborators to help me get this to the finish line. I would never have finished this without the urgency and the accountability of this group of people. Like even Joe, when he came on as editor, would be like, I need the footage that's missing from this. I need the clip from this. And I had to feed the beast every day. And again, this is just me as kind of documentary person talking to other documentary people of like, I needed that. You know what I mean? I needed to be held accountable, or I would have found many reasons to procrastinate emotionally and spiritually to not make this film. So it was when I finally had collaborators and the attention of other people and the accountability of other people that the film got made. And that was like a huge thing for me, you know? And
Yeah.
that feels like an insight of adult creative life, for me at least.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also imagine, your experience with This American Life. I could sort of feel it in the film, in the sense of, it was very narration driven,
Yeah.
in the way that This American Life pieces are. So it makes me wonder about the process of writing the narration. And was that piecemeal too? Did you just do a lot of scratch narration and cut scenes to the scratch and then finesse it as you fine tune the editing? Or because you needed to, without the narration, I'm not sure how you shot some of the scenes of, giving away your stuff at the end, for instance. I don't imagine you did that and then wrote some narration to that.
No, I mean, kind of, right?
Yeah, I mean, this was we threw everything at this. And again, Joe should also weigh in, but like there was definitely scratch. I mean, I would literally record things on my phone and just like throw it at Joe or the other editor and just like send him a file and just see what it feels. Because that's the thing about this kind of filmmaking is it is all a series of endless experiments. What's working, what's not working? Does the insight land? Are you saying too much? Are you over narrating and you have it in the footage? And it can't, I know no other way to do it than to try it, than to work on it. So there was intense periods of having scratch narration. And then there came a point where we really started, that's when I brought in this friend of mine, Adam, where okay, let's interrogate every sentence and make sure it's make sure we're seeding ideas earlier. Like let's plant that thought here. That's going to pay off here. And it got very granular at certain points, the writing. And I think, voiceover writing, and I think maybe other documentarians on the call will relate, it's not writing in the traditional sense. It can't be, it's almost aphoristic. It has to be very spare. It can't hijack what's happening in the footage. And that was a big, and I think Joe and I, having worked on this together, that was a huge part of the This American Life collaboration when we adapted the radio show into a TV show. Their skill, their superpower is narration. Um, and they can take a bunch of voiceover and summarize it in 3 or 4 sentences and not need the character to do that. They can do that as the narrator. But often in filmmaking, you need the on-screen information to be conveying story and information and character detail. And they always wanted to over-narrate in television. And I think it took a long time for them to kind of pull back some of those instincts. Would you agree, Joe?
Yeah, I mean, I remember when we were working on that show, I was this kind of bizarre liaison between radio and TV. And I was negotiating that between everybody, but quite literally they would write, it was a clear blue day, the sky was blue and there was not a cloud in sight, and then the shot would be clouds, and it took them a long time to kind of figure that out, to their credit they did. That's why the second season kind of moves much better than the first. But in terms of the VO, and this is something I did on This American Life, like you kind of build a section, and then I would say, Chris, we need some VO kind of about your family and the struggle you're having with your family. And he would develop that, but you would build sections without VO with the anticipation that it would be there so that you can give shape to the thing. The nice thing about that is that it kind of frees you from overusing the VO, because then you're not trying to jam in a paragraph. Conversely, there would be times where Chris would have VO and then I would just cut it down, or we would repurpose it somewhere else. It's kind of a free-flowing thing in that respect. But from my perspective, I think the best thing to do is try and use the footage to explain as much as humanly possible, and then you have the VO to supplement that. And then there would be sections where, let's say we're doing a passage of time with his family and we're blasting through 10 years in 1 minute. And that's where you say, Chris, we need to punctuate these points and you need to get us from here to here in the voiceover.
So you have writer credit on it, Joe. Is it because in a sense you're writing it in the edit, not that you're literally writing the lines, but that
well, I'm going to argue if you're an editor, then you're a writer on
yeah.
the film.
Yeah.
I would like to support what he's saying, which is I have always felt that editors, even if he's not writing words, the scenes, the information, the interview sequencing, it is a form of writing. It is undeniably writing. And I just felt like it was important for that credit to be recognized, and that him shaping the film and helping structure the film was this is an essay, right? And he was in the trenches, as was, me and my co-writer Adam. We're actually making the voiceover words. So I feel like that's a really under acknowledged thing in terms of documentary filmmaking, is that the editor is a writer too.
Yeah, no, I agree. I give the editors, always give them writer credit on my films for that exact reason.
My inflammatory political statement is that, a lot of directors run around and they take writer credit on films that are like heavily archival, that type of thing, might not have any voiceover at all. It drives me crazy.
Yeah. Oh, when you really get down to it, I feel like actually editors should often get co-director credit on certain documentaries and don't, and in my experience sometimes don't want it, because that's not their interest or temperament. But it's an interesting blurry line sometimes. So Joe, the index cards on the wall remind me to ask, how, there's so much footage. I mean, how many hours of footage was there when you add up all the hard drives and archival stuff you had? Ballpark.
That's an excellent question. We would have to figure that out. I'm sure it's many hundreds of hours, particularly when you're dealing with all of, Chris was like an insane person. So he was like walking around with an 8mm high 8, just shooting everything. I think that slowed down as he had kids, strangely. But yeah, it's a lot to go through, for sure.
So how did you go through it? I mean, did you, because there's a lot of montages over the years, did you start almost immediately breaking down to selects and on every shot of Chris looking at, some object, how did you organize hundreds of hours of footage?
I mean, it is a matter of making selects. I think Chris certainly pared it down. And, poor Claire, I think, did a lot of that kind of whittling down of material so that it wasn't as torturous for me. But yeah, that's the process. You have to watch everything. I always think of, I don't know if you guys have read like Robert Caro or any of his new, these interviews that are coming out, or he put out a memoir, and he is like, he is the model for an editor, basically, that does this kind of archival work. He is just a guy. He's the guy in All the President's Men, sitting in the library, flipping through every library card, trying to find the book. He goes through every piece of paper, and I think you have to take the same approach when you're doing these kinds of films. You just have to watch everything. And then in that process, you start to identify themes or connections, or how this thing relates to that thing, or this image is the perfect image to evoke this. Because a lot of it is you're taking incongruous images and creating more meaning out of it.
Right.
It's that like A plus B equals C, D actually. But
Okay, so you're going through, hundreds of hours of footage, looking at everything.
yeah,
You're also at the same time, I think you said you were working on the George Carlin documentary with Judd Apatow.
yeah.
How do you keep track of all this stuff? I mean, how do you organize it? Do you have software that you use? Do you just put them on index cards? You can't because you're not really breaking them down into
Um,
scenes yet.
I mean, I think that initial process of going through things, so you have a lot of it, a lot of my organization is just like the selects and breaking down the material, and it lives in the Avid. I think I'll do index cards just to kind of cement things in my mind, like that physical process of writing down and figuring out beats and what order that might go into. Just happens in the beginning, and then I find that I never refer to it again. Like these here, I did them once, and I've never looked at them again. Um, we also used Miro, which is an online. It allows you to do note cards, and you can share it and collaborate. And I think that that was a way for Claire and Chris to really work through stuff.
That's Miro, Miro.
Yeah.
Okay.
Basically like a digital note card program, which got us through a certain beginning phase, but was abandoned at some point also.
So, Joe, what are some of the yeah, I assume you're creating folders, the selects. So, what are some of the names you would give to these folders, in terms of,
Not folders. I just have one big selects folder, and I have my sequences in there. So,
okay.
the initial process is I'm screening and I'm just making fat selects. So maybe I have 10 hours and that cuts down to 5 hours. I take out all the crap that I know is not going to be useful. And then this might be useful. And then there's a secondary pass where I do pare down selects. And then I'm really kind of whittling it down. And then the last process is when I start cutting, and then I kind of know how I want to attack it, what I need. And so there's that. But I always have these things that I can refer back to. That fat selects might just be, it could be little errant bits of sound off camera. It could be cutaways. It could be exterior shots, whatever. And the nice thing about that is you can scrub through it super fast, just bam, 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 and find what you want. Um,
But you still have to scrub through very fast, maybe a 5 hour, 10 hour thing of,
maybe, but one thing that I tell all my AEs is like, people like to use locators in source clips or something like that. And I tell them, don't do that. You make the selects. That's one of the foundational things that I figured out watching other editors when I was an AE. Like that, without question, is the best process. If only because you can go from edit point to edit point. And if you have it in your mind through that screening process, it's kind of in your brain. You can remember things that you want.
when you're working with an A or several A's, what do you have them do?
A lot of it is, ingest and categorization. When you're dealing with archival, I think the process of bringing that archival and assigning licensors and things like that is unfortunately pretty crucial. So they're doing a lot of that, but we've worked a lot on trying to create efficiencies in that process so that they have more free time to do more creative things. So I'll pass them sequences to work on. I have one AE, honestly, who he's cutting a whole film with a young filmmaker. So that's that's a lot. There's the grunt work that you have to do, but hopefully that is automated as possible, and then I can get them doing creative stuff.
Hmm.
I would like to chime in for 1 second and say that
Sure.
Joe has an unusual, almost uncanny ability to metabolize astonishing amounts of footage. And I don't just say this with my own project, but like, for instance, he did this 4 hour documentary about Gary Shandling with Judd Apatow also. Again, breathtaking amounts of archival that kind of he has a kind of virtuoso recall and assembly instinct and is mercenary in his decision making, is often like, nope, that's garbage, it's done, it's dead. You know what I mean? Like there's a kind of like relentless forward momentum. In fact, I have never worked with somebody who is almost fine cutting as he's cutting. I mean, it sounds crazy, but it's a wild thing to behold. And so there's something very unique about Joe and Joe's talent. I just want to go on record saying
Oh,
that.
also invaluable when you're working with hundreds of hours of footage to
Yes.
like, be able to eliminate so much of it right off the bat.
Yeah.
Well,
But
that's
to
the
have a feeling.
fundamental,
Yeah.
that's the fundamental job. You're there to make decisions. Like I recoil in horror when people say like, "Oh yeah, our first assembly was 10 hours." It's like, well, what the what? Huh? No, my first cuts will be maybe 20 minutes fat at the most, but um, you know,
How much attention are you paying to clean sound when you're doing these fast cuts? I mean, I've worked with an editor once who didn't want to pay any attention to it because she said, I'm just going to re-edit it any or want, changes. So why should I spend all this time? But it's very hard for me to look at it if the
I think
sound isn't somewhat smooth.
my methodology has always been like, if somebody took this rough cut and accidentally put it on TV, some people wouldn't know. So I think it's hard to watch something that's too rough,
Yeah.
particularly with sound. So I'm pretty focused on sound to the extent that I'll do cleanup. I do a lot of sound design. Um, yeah, I mean the thing is pretty polished even in the first pass
Great.
because, well, I mean also partially because you have one opportunity to sell people on your idea. In my experience, so if it's rough, then uh, you're kind of you're giving opportunity for the vultures to come in
Yeah.
sometimes. Um, Not that this is not the case with Chris, but I feel that way personally. I feel like I have one shot to kind of get my ideas out before people start giving me notes, and you transition from what is a creative state where you're trying, you're just in flow and you're doing things, and once you present it and you get notes, then you're in a reactive state, and you lose that opportunity to try things.
Getting back to the narration for a second, when you're recording the final narration, it felt really smooth, and as if you were almost doing it in a take. And I know you weren't doing it in a take. How many takes would you do at a time when you're doing it? If you wrote like a paragraph's worth of narration, like for the Bowie scene we were talking about with Uncle
Well,
Floyd?
this is an incredible question that is a reflection of contemporary technology. That was something about this process that blew my mind, which is I have done that in the past where, you go in one day and you're doing everything in one pass. And what is your mood that day? What is your vocal capacity? Are you sick that day? Um, I was recording this VO often in my house or in the car or quickly getting things to Joe. And I was not self-conscious and I was in the moment and I was not thinking about performing or anything. And we got it in over the course of, months. And at one point we had a date on the calendar that I was going to re-record the VO. And then Joe with the sound mixer, and Joe, please clarify the process, but they did a kind of AI pass at making everything match. And so all of those casual takes, all of that effortlessness, all of that unself-conscious performance lived in the final film. I never did the narration in one shot. I never sat in a studio and did everything all at once. It was all the miscellaneous narration, different mics, and it was remarkable to me that it pretty much, we had to punch in a couple of little sentences here and there, but for the most part, the AI mixing allowed for total continuity. I mean, Joe, do you want to share? But that was like
And it
breakthrough to me.
wasn't, I don't think there was AI necessarily employed. It wasn't like they pressed a button and it
No,
equalized
no. But I
everything.
thought there was like, a
There's the
cleanup.
EQ, there's an EQ pass, and then I'm sure there was like some noise removal, that type of thing, which we would do on everything, of course. I
But
think, but
you didn't anticipate it being work. Like we thought we were going to have to re-record it. Remember? I mean,
yeah, we did initial test. We were scared about re-recording it because some of the performances were so strong. Um, and we wanted to keep it. So like what you see is probably like 6 months worth of VO from recorded at different times, and it was all equalized out. Um, I don't. I mean, to the point of AI, that I'm sure people are familiar with it, but there's Isotope, if you know that product, and that's something that I know I use a lot. I've always enjoyed when people have been scandalized by AI. It's, we've been using that for 5 years. I mean, I would call it machine learning, but like, noise removal and equalizing EQ, and there's stuff like dialogue match, so you can match mics. That's become kind of an incredible tool that I personally use in my rough cuts a lot. Um, and I've definitely used it in Flipside a lot to clean up audio and separate things out. So yeah, that's what happened.
Yeah. Adobe Enhance, in Premiere is, incredible as well.
All these things. Yeah.
Yeah. Particularly when you're behind the camera asking questions and, the mic is not like on you.
Yeah.
Amazing. So, by the way, I want to just throw out that we're going to open it up to questions soon from folks out there. So if
I hope
you,
we're hitting things people want to hear about. I'm always conscious of the
well, definitely stuff I want to hear about. Usually we don't get so quite into the weeds of the process, but this one is like a particularly good one. We're so in that vein, I'm curious. By the way, use the hands up function if you want to ask a question, which I believe is under the reactions icon at the bottom of the screen. So given that, what you're dealing with the film, Chris, is, the struggle of work and, your desire to create art and, balancing it with the need to have a family life, and the course of the film, you're kind of coming over to the satisfactions of family, outweighing this, desire to make this mark, this artistic mark. I mean, would you say that is something that's carrying forward in your life? Is that something you sort of, a demon you needed to exercise in the course of making the film? It was a discovery you made?
Yeah, I mean, I think what the film was also trying to do was look at other people's lives and the choices they made, right? So for instance, David Bilch figures into the last part of the film,
Mhm.
and he's at this incredibly fragile moment in his life, and
Yeah.
he's thinking about a lot of regrets he has, right? And that maybe he gave himself so totally to the art, to the creativity, to everything. Um, and I think that, that was one of those examples where I was reflecting on the sort of sacrifices that go along with that, or the sort of consequences of making those choices. Um, I feel like this is just going to be an endless conversation and balance. And I think what's tricky now, I mean, I was talking about this with somebody the other day, but like so many things are changing right now. Like the documentary market is a mess, and even the value of being able to of being able to sell nonfiction films now is in free fall, and even commercials, which was my theoretical sellout day job, those are in free fall and collapsing in on themselves. That my new anxiety is about, like, what am I going to do with this skill set going forward? Can I continue to make a living doing it? I mean, the state of the industry and even fiction and feature films and not and documentaries just feels in such crazy peril. So I think this is going to be a question I am going to be navigating going forward, which is how to make things, how to continue to make things you care about, how to continue to make a living doing anything that, you've done up to this point. I had an interesting conversation with somebody recently about how so many Gen Xers committed to professional careers like being a music critic or going into publishing, or filmmaking in certain forms, and that all of those careers are loomingly obsolete, if not already obsolete. And like, what do you do in when you're still in a vital part of your working life to pivot? When literally the industry you were in, journalism, is collapsing. And how do you find a new path in midlife? So that is also kind of, it's there in Flipside, maybe not completely articulated, but those are conversations I'm having with friends. I mean, I have a friend who was a music writer for years, and he's going back to school at age 53 to be a therapist. It's like, what do you do? It's not inevitable that this career exists for me going forward. So that's kind of the new obsession.
Do you have, and Joe, this is for you as well, any desire to work in the fictitious film landscape,
Hmm.
what we call the F word?
I always say, people always ask me that. It would have to be the right thing. I have a strange reaction that whenever I deal with dailies from narrative stuff, which I have an opportunity to do strangely as a product of my docs, I think it's so ridiculous. So it's just like, this is so fucking stupid. Like they're putting on a play and they're taking it so serious. It looks ridiculous. It's not, and I love watching narrative TV shows and films, but physically being in there and looking at it, I find it ridiculous. Um, I get so much satisfaction out of doing documentary work, and it's so creatively fulfilling. I don't know if I would have that experience doing narrative, but and also whenever I cut scenes from narrative stuff, it's so easy. I mean, it's a ridiculous thing to say, but I find it so easy. It just comes together so effortlessly. But granted, there's nobody giving me notes on that stuff or telling me do it differently or that's not what I intended. But
Well, also for the most part, it's scripted, so you're working with takes of scripted material as opposed to creating, in a sense, a script out of all these parts.
disparate things, yeah, exactly. But I remember, Brett Morgan, who I've done films with, he was doing some narrative stuff, and that's what he would just dance around. He's like, "It's so easy," you know. The discovery of that is pretty fascinating.
What about you, Chris?
Um, I made a run at trying to do some like TV directing and stuff, but it was very tricky because nobody wanted to sort of take a chance. They'd be like, "Oh, great meeting, but we're not going to be the first show that you do." Um, so I don't think necessarily that will be a path for me. Again, I've sort of let go of that. Every once in a while, I get a weird call and go take a meeting about something. But I think and I also get to exercise a little bit of that in the commercial directing work. I know it's a funny thing and we haven't talked about that, but I still do a fair amount of commercial directing and I'm casting actors and we're making up, whole things based on scripted stuff. So I get to do a version of that. Sometimes the commercial work is more documentary specific. It's interviewing people, it's nonfiction, but it can also be a lot of the sort of manufactured naturalism of documentary. That style sort of, appropriated for commercial purposes. So, but no, I don't think I have a new career is going to open up as a fiction film
There's
director.
no scripts in your drawer
No,
that
no script. I mean,
uh,
there's some documentary projects that are, kind of I'm talking to people about stuff like that, but no one's knocking down my door for fiction.
anything you want to share, or you want to keep it to yourself till
Well, the only thing is I'm always so nervous about stuff until it feels totally real. You know what I mean? Like that until like literally amounts of money have changed hands, but there's things that are happening. Um, and I'm just a little reluctant because some of the stuff involves people who I think are warming up to the process of being filmed, and I feel like I wouldn't want to um, totally out it as an official project quite yet. So, but hustling a lot of stuff.
I
these
would
are
also
well known.
argue that these forms are not mutually exclusive. I think there are appropriate ways to incorporate narrative into documentary and vice versa. I don't, the stories are stories to some extent.
Yeah.
These are just
Yeah.
weird classifications we give it, but I can definitely foresee, there are plenty of documentaries that are essentially narrative films. Like
Yeah.
I did a film called Jane, and I would argue that the first act of that film is a narrative film.
Yeah. Jane Goodall. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, it's interesting you say that, Chris. I assume you mean these are public figures or well-known people.
Yeah, one person in particular. I'm a little
Yeah.
reluctant to sort of totally say it's happening yet until it
Yeah.
is a little further down the line, you know?
Yeah. It's interesting because, I'm not dealing with well-known people, so I like to talk about it because I feel like in talking about it, I actually put it into existence. It's a way of not only kind of brainstorming ideas, but seeing how people react to it.
Yeah.
And I feel responsible. Okay, now I've said I'm going to do it. I better do it.
That's true. No, it's a great form of accountability.
Yeah. Alrighty, I have more questions, but there are some people with their hands up, so we'll get to that. And if there's time, I'll circle back to my final one. Simone, hello.
Hello there. I love the film. I love the editing, really good. And I love that you guys were speaking about the creative process because that's what I was thinking the whole time I was watching the film. And I wanted to go back a little bit in that part of the conversation. So you spoke about this a little bit, you had all these little stories or something. So at one point you realized that they all belong to the same story and that you could put them all together. Um, at what part of the process that you were able to sit down and, streamline a storyline of of the film uh, in a clear way that you could just show it to people and people would understand that? Because I understand it seems like there were all these things in your mind and all this part of the same perception of all these things, but then at one point you were able to see it clearly and say, okay, this is part of the same story. So I'm curious to understand how did it go from all over the place to, okay, this belongs to one story? And
Yeah.
at what point that Joe, as the editor who was working very closely with you, also understood the whole many things altogether part of the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was just a constant instinct to follow footage that had life to it and ideas that I was interested or obsessed with. So, for instance, I wrote a treatment at some point about a Flipside documentary. In fact, I thought at one point this should be a bunch of half hours, right? So you do a David Milch half hour and you do a Judd Apatow half hour. And the idea would be that the record store would be the portal through which you would spin out into these other things. Um, I think that again, it was like this pile of unfinished stuff. Um, and just the sense that there was a lot of ideas in there that were interesting, and is there a way that we could shape it to sort of investigate this midlife moment? You know what I mean? Like we just acted on that instinct, and then what would happen is breakthroughs would accumulate. So we started to put footage, and I would say, like we had the Herman stuff and we had the record store stuff, and then it was like, well, wait a minute, what about the Ira stuff? We've got this sort of unfinished Ira thing, and then we would sort of park that in there. And just looking at this accumulation, I feel like I want to tell you that there was a breakthrough moment of just total clarity where it all worked, but I think it was this, again, endless series of experiments, simply acting on a feeling about like, I love this material. I love what he's saying. I love what she's saying. I love this Herman thing, and it never is going to see the light of day. And by the way, there's a funny backstory to how David Milch paid for this, but had no intention of ever really following through on it being a film. Like, can all these things get in there? And I kept also acting on instincts almost too late in the process, to the point where the production team and Joe were getting annoyed with me. So just as an example, I was convinced late in the film, I was like, the narration needs to exist somewhere. It can't just float above the film. And so there was this abandoned radio station in the Meadowlands. It's not abandoned really, it's a transistor, but if anyone lives in New York or New Jersey, you see it from the New Jersey Turnpike. It's very Sopranos-esque. And it's this this decaying radio tower in the Meadowlands. And I convinced them to let me shoot there. And I did the entire narration and filmed it. And my thought was, is I was like the DJ at the end of the world telling the final story about this dying era. And Joe said, this is not a good idea. The film does not need this. Stop. And I said, no, I must do this. And sure enough, I came home all proud of myself with my beautiful, exquisitely poetic looking, decaying radio station footage. And Joe put it in, and it was horrendous. Because what happened was, is you saw me performing the documentary, and I'm not a good actor, and I'm kind of annoying to look at. And it was like it brought all these other feelings to the footage and performance that distracted from it. And I realized that the narration hovering over, existing in this kind of unseen any space, was the correct strategy, right? And Joe knew it, and I didn't, and I had to follow through.
I think the thing that we like kept harping on was that the film like rejected any sense of artifice. Like it did not want that. And, you know, all those times where he's reading the VO and he's in the woods and he steps on something and it feels handmade, like that's what the film had to be. So this was, yeah, it was a little too painted.
It was too constructed. It was too staged. But so I guess what I'm saying is it was just endless decision making and finding the connections. And there was no one breakthrough. I think a breakthrough that I always do remember, though, is when it became clear that you could introduce a character, they could say something interesting, maybe even vaguely profound. You could leave them for a long period of time, and then they could recur. That to me was when we broke up the mini documentaries and started to braid them in unique ways and say, okay, now we're talking about family. Herman's going to recur. Now we're talking about creativity. David Milch is going to recur. And that there was almost like these chorus of philosophical reflection that could be peppered throughout. That was when things really started getting interesting. But it was again, this is just, you all know this, the creative process. It was in the making that these discoveries were happening. It wasn't a like sit down and realize it kind of thing. It was just that returning to it, cutting it, hating things, being like, why is this driving me crazy? I hate this. And then realizing, oh, this is why, let's fix it. So I don't know. I hope I answered your question.
If there was a breakthrough, if anything, it was the Herman stuff. And then like knowing that he spoke to certain themes, like there's a moment where the kind of film talks to, it tells the audience it's going to be something different, which is, you know, Chris is starting to do commercials in the archive, and Herman comes in and he says, like, I had to make money. I had a family to support. I had to make money. And then the audience is like, oh, something's happening here. I think that's what's going on. And then that little bit of VO that is in the cold open where you tell the audience, I never finished this. Yeah. And that kind of twist, I think, really kind of energized the whole process.
Yeah. This sort of speaks to, you know, what you're saying before about fiction films. And you know, this is the joy and angst of figuring this out while you're, you know, in the creative process involved in doing this in documentary is so much more challenging, you know, because you're, you know, it's almost like improvising versus, you know, playing music off of sheets. And I'm sorry, I'll get to a question in a second, but it also begs the question, if this were back in the days of DVDs and you were going to do a DVD extra with this film, what would it be? What would that look like?
Well, Doug, it's funny you should ask. You know, Oscilloscope, the company that distributed it, is still very committed to these analog artifacts. So we're actually doing a DVD. And to be honest with you, once again, as with the crazy process of making Flipside, I had too many ideas for DVD extras. So for instance, oh, let's include the documentary I made for Judd, which is called The Funny People Diaries. We'll put that on there. Let's put an episode of Uncle Floyd's entire television show. We'll put that on there. Now, the problem is nobody wants to pay for the rights for anything to be a DVD extra. So my optimistic, ambitious DVD extra ideas are sort of collapsing before my eyes, but there are still, there's extra material. There's Floyd performing other songs. There's, you know, there's all kinds of fun stuff that I'm trying to gather for this. And again, I'm aware that maybe, you know, 100 people will buy this, but it still feels worth doing. for me as a
Yes. And for the
analog.
5 people who have DVD players, yeah.
Exactly.
Simon, you're up.
Okay, thanks. Joe, first question. I'm interested to know, obviously there were over 100 hours of footage. Uh, how many times did you have to watch the footage before you could start making decisions? Was once enough, or did you have to do it several times? And then did you have many major disagreements during the process? I think Chris has talked about some. And how did you resolve any disagreements? Thanks.
I mean, that's the reason I make selects, is that I watch it once and then I'm just working from the selects from that point forward. So once, and then obviously you review it again and again and make and modify your decisions. Do we have any major disagreements? I'm sure we fought a lot. Strangely enough, not in the making of the movie, but like in the post of the movie.
Yeah.
Well, and by the way, I would say fighting there was a couple of prickly moments, but it was all love. There was nothing personal. It was all process stuff, and it was never. And by the way, I knew that Joe was, one of a couple people who believed in this thing and was going to help me make it. And the endless deep gratitude I was feeling at every moment that he was getting up each day and thinking about this. I mean, you guys know this. It's just to have anyone have any expression of belief in what you're doing, to sustain belief, because you're doing that yourself. But when others get on board, I remember an exciting moment for me was when there was tension between, let's say, my co-writer Adam would watch something, or Joe would be like, no, we have to leave this in. I was like, oh my God, they believe in this thing now. Like, it's now cohered enough, and it's a thing that is assured of its completion, and people are feeling like they want to argue for an idea or a section or preserving some footage. I was like, this is breakthrough. Like, they care. You know what I mean? Because that meant I had people who were going to help me finish it. So that was like a huge thing.
Did Judd weigh in during the editing process, or did you wait to show him cuts? Or
Really, like, there was a point where like after Claire stepped off, I was like, I'm going to do a pass on the first 20 minutes and we should share it with Judd, because we needed a little support, and he was a good resource for that and was very helpful with Milch, for instance, like putting that together. So that was a point, other than to say like, I love it. No. And he would say like, we need more Milch, right? But
yeah, I mean, first of all, he came on pretty late in the process, I should say. Like, he really, but we were at a moment of like, our gas tank was empty a little bit, and I think he really, look, he has been nothing but impossibly, incredibly, almost, it surprises me. Like, he posted about it the other day, and I'm still astonished when he just spontaneously decides he wants to tell people they must see this thing, But he came on, and his notes were often, we would always take them really seriously. And his thing was like, oh, it should end with Milch. And I was like, no, but I think we need this coda where we return to the record store, and it would force us to try things and move things around. At one point, I was convinced that David Bowie was the ending. And then you would kind of go off and cut to the credits, and that was the end of the movie. But then we moved it around, and the problem was the Milch thing got so heavy that needed to be sort of further towards the end. So again, there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of trying things, moving modular parts around. It was again, it was a constant experimentation.
Yeah, Judd is great, and like incredibly supportive, and helped us out a lot. Like, when we had to get the Bowie song, we were rejected initially, and he kind of went into action and helped us out. And Brett Morgan, strangely enough, who did the Bowie film, which I'm sure people have seen, he also came in and helped us negotiate that.
so, Joe, how is working with? You've worked with Judd. You've worked on a couple projects with Brett. I think with R.J. Cutler on one of them. How is working with those directors different than working with Chris? Is it a different process, or is it remarkably similar?
Maybe it's only different with Brett, because Brett is very, very hands-on and
Yeah.
is a great editor himself, and is, an intense personality. Um, we can talk about that on the side.
Well, so is RJ, having worked with him before.
You know what? I mean, I maybe cumulatively spent like 2 weeks with RJ
Yeah.
over that whole process. And I think it's similar. I mean, Judd is the busiest man on the face of the earth. And also, honestly, since Belushi, I've worked remotely. So I work out of this space. I send cuts, and there's back and forth, but very, very rarely am I working in a room with somebody. And that's the case with Chris, of course, as well. But I think this was a very collaborative thing with Chris. We were going back and forth a lot. We were because for me it's a strange experience because I'm in the material, I'm in the footage. I've kind of had a parallel existence with Chris where we've worked on a lot of the same things. I know the people he's talking about. I remember when Judd called him and shipped him off to California, or when he started doing commercials. I think we've had conversations where I'm like, Chris, why are you fucking doing these commercials all the time? Why are you so that's a unique experience that I think is very different, of course.
Is your mother talking to Judd these days, Chris?
Well, actually, at one of the screenings in Los Angeles, they buried the hatchet. It was actually a beautiful thing. Judd was doing the Q&A. My mom happened to be in town and was there for it. And literally, there was a moment where they hugged it out publicly. So yes, Pat Wilcha and Judd have reconciled.
Great. Candace, you are up next.
Hi, congrats on the film. I really loved it, and the theme in particular really spoke to me. I'm not even sure how to phrase this question, but something I think about a lot is you were saying that this film, like, it wasn't fully formed, you didn't really know what it was going to be. And that's how I approach a lot of the areas I want to explore. Sort of, I feel like I'm going down this rabbit hole. I have a question that's kind of haunting me and I need to go down this rabbit hole. But because we work in documentary, you're not going alone down the rabbit hole. You have to like pull all sorts of people with you, both in front of the camera and behind the camera. And so how do you know that this rabbit hole is worth exploring and dragging all sorts of people? It's high stakes, right? Because sometimes you go down and you're like, oh, I don't think it doesn't work for whatever reason. And so, yeah, when do you know it's like worth going down and continuing to drag all these people with you? And when do you decide it's like, maybe I have to pull out? I don't know if there's an answer to that question, but
Yeah. I mean, often the people don't get dragged into it right away, right? Like I'll just opportunistically be shooting and interviewing and starting to accumulate material. That's one method, which again, I feel like was very much the way I kind of admired people like, Ross McElwee and Doug, your work. It was like this idea that you can accumulate things over time. You're gathering, you don't necessarily know even what it's going to be, but you know that you want to embed it with that long durational kind of quality. But as Flipside is a testament, I just acted on a lot of, I mean, and there's certainly other things that are not represented Flipside, other failures, other projects that didn't see the light of day. But I would just follow and try to, see if there was a there, see if something was working. I think what's tricky now is just it's the money part of it that's so hard. I feel terrible not paying people. And I feel like I can only ask so many favors of people. So one of the benefits of my commercial directing career is I can often compensate a person by employing them at their best possible day rate on a commercial gig and then say, hey, on the back end of this, will you shoot this thing for me? Or can we do a couple of days of editing and just try to. So there's this constant sort of tension and back and forth between the art and commerce of it all. And there's just any way forward. I just did a treatment for something that is just placing a bet that is an idea that I just think is interesting. And I'm asking a friend to help me do a little video to accompany it. And again, I just feel like it's all about placing those small bets and figuring out when you can kind of compensate those people properly or reward them with other work you're doing somehow. I don't know. I feel like I'm not totally answering your question, but I am a fellow rabbit hole chaser. And I just feel like I continue to want to do it. There's people that I'm just super drawn to, moments in time that I know are going to pass if I don't document it. And I just kind of act on them. I think what's scary now is like in the wake of Flipside kind of kicking around and being on the circuit of festivals and stuff, I was getting back in touch with friends and some people, some filmmakers, and people made entire films that were at festivals and just didn't find distribution. And that's kind of heartbreaking too, that like you make the whole thing, it actually gets a public reception that's pretty positive, and now there's no home for it. I mean, I feel lucky in that Flipside, in this kind of very apocalyptic documentary marketplace, at least got distribution and got seen on some scale and can be seen now streaming. So, that's a whole nother conversation, I suppose. But I would just say if you're still passionate about it, to act on all those documentary impulses and do your best to take care of the people who are going along for the ride.
Chris, are you able to kind of follow how it's doing on digital platforms? Do you get any kind of analytics, statistics, anything
I
from?
made the mistake of
Yeah, Chris.
asking. I made the mistake of asking after the first weekend. I was like, "Hey, had to do," and it was so breathtakingly small a number that I was like,
Oh,
I'm not going to ask again for a while. I think the thing about Flipside that I'm learning is that, and I love this about it, is that it really feels like a word of mouth kind of film. Like, I'll get this people writing and DMing and just saying, oh, these two people told me to see it, and this person, and I think it's going to find its way out there just at a slower burn. You know what I mean? There hasn't been some, I mean, I will say we had a theatrical release, which is kind of an almost obsolete thing to do. Um, and it was very humbling. I mean, it made me realize that, like, first of all, nobody goes and sees documentaries in theaters anymore. I feel like there's empirical evidence to support that over and over and over.
Well, I mean,
Please jump in.
the distribution of these things is something that we all collectively have to figure out. But it is clear that distribution, it does work, the in-theater, but it has to be eventized. You can't just throw it in the theater and expect people to come. Like if you do Q&As, people show up. There's Gary Hustwit, I think, is a model for everybody, but he makes a film. He does his own distribution, which I recognize is a huge pain in the ass and very difficult. But these are events, and he sells tickets at a premium and I think pays for the movie and makes money on it. But, the hustle is real. It's not, you almost, it's one thing to make the movie, but getting it out there and getting it seen, particularly if it's a small kind of weird movie like we made, you have to think out of the box. And that's
But I would like to weigh in with one detail though, something that was, again, super humbling for me to learn in the process, which was when I made this first documentary, The Target Shoots First, it would screen in a city and I would write to the local weekly paper film critic, and maybe it would get reviewed, maybe it wouldn't, and people would come out, and there was a process by which it found its way across the United States and ultimately to HBO. With Flipside, the theatrical process, yes, when we eventized it, it was amazing. We had Ira Glass do Q&As, we had incredible people in LA, and those all sold out, and it was incredible. But when they were booking new theaters, often the theaters across the United States wouldn't decide to program it until that same week. So they decide on a Tuesday and they program it on Friday. There was no time window to promote it. So you'd be relying on the local theater's email list. And I naively was like, let's write to the, local, and they were like, Facebook erased all of that infrastructure, all of the weekly papers and the local film critic who might take an interest in Seattle and write about it. All that stuff is gone. So there was a tricky process of the distribution was happening in this high wire real-time way where theaters were placing bets based on what it did in New York or what it did in LA. And oftentimes there was no timeline to promote within that window, if that makes sense. So there was a lot of screenings where it would play for like 2 nights in upstate New York, and that was kind of it, I think are you muted? Oh,
I am muted. Did you have much of a festival run?
well, we premiered at Toronto, which was incredible and provided a deadline for us, right? We were still making the thing, and we applied to TIFF during that process. And it was when we got in that we were like, holy crap, now we have to finish it. And that gave us all of the momentum and the wind at our back to complete the film. You know, I'm a little cynical about some of this festival experiences I had where they are monetizing your film. You are erasing a lot of your audience for it, like in New York, where, you know, you're killing yourself to get people out. You're not seeing any of that, you know, revenue. That's all going to the festival. The festivals, I mean, again, I remember when I did Target Shoots first, it was a little bit more of a decadent era where sometimes you get flown a place or they'd put you up. All that stuff is gone, right? Nobody's paying for your plane tickets. So you're out there paying to be there. So I got a little cynical about the festival experience pretty quickly. And I found that, you know, it was I didn't love that part of the experience. Joe, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's turning into a scam for sure.
It felt like
and there, you know, there are a couple. There are the, you know, Sundance, obviously, some of the larger festivals. Like you want to have your premiere, but I think after that point, it's true. There's such a limited audience, particularly people who are going to seek out a movie and go to the theater of a certain kind. Yeah, that you are neutering your audience and you're getting none of the scratch.
At what point did Oscilloscope come on board?
Well, we had sales agents, and they were great. And there was a lot of interest after Toronto, which was incredible. You know, we got some incredible reviews out of Toronto, which again, were just, some of the publicity has been incredible. But we, again, walked into the wall of the current streaming environment, which is like, you know, true crime, celebrity, and sports documentaries. And that's sort of all anyone wants. And I certainly had a lot of fun conversations and meetings as a result of it. But, you know, once the streamers kind of all passed on a kind of, we are going to buy this as an original, that's when we were sort of examining our options. And that's when we had a couple of distributors express interest, and Oscilloscope was one of them. So it was sort of after we went through the sort of sales process. And, you know, they've been great, but they are totally challenged by the environment too, and how little money there is to market, and it's all handmade and very few people working on things. But, you know, I feel they're kindred spirits, and they certainly get the film and the aesthetic of the film, and they've been great.
And they make very good DVDs with their packaging and design.
That's what we're about to do. Yes.
Yes. Antoine, how you doing? You're staying safe, I hope?
Yes. Till today, all is well. We'll see tomorrow. But no, for the time being, all is well. Chris, thank you for this beautiful movie. I'm a Gen Xer, so I kind of relate to the things you were saying. Not at that level, but the process of going through that. So yeah, it's a beautifully made, beautiful impression of it. In the film, you're saying you were kind of set up by David Milch for Herman Leonard because he knew that you were not going to be able to finish the film. But in a sense, it was a way for him to feel recognized for all his work that he's done and to keep that kind of legacy. How about your legacy? How about do you see all the work and all the things that you went through with the original idea of what kind of career you wanted to do, being drawn for all the reasons in the world into commercials, and going back into a film like Flipside? And how do you see the future? How do you see your legacy? Do you think about it or not?
I would say unequivocally, no, I'm not really sort of legacy focused. I mean, what I would like to do is make more long form documentaries. And I think part of the goal of Flipside was to create a little space to revisit my nonfiction career, because the balance got off, right? I started doing the commercials, and the commercials is a hamster wheel unto itself. You're pursuing one. They're so competitive to get that when you get one, you're sort of already obsessed with trying to get the next one. And it's a whole racket unto itself. And so what my hope for for Flipside would be that it would maybe help remind some people who sort of finance these things that I'm capable of making them, and that can I make a couple more in the next few years? You know what I mean? That was sort of the dream version of events. And the David Milch thing, I mean, you didn't ask a question about it, but that was fascinating, which is, to me, that was one of those moments where David Milch, I'm in his office and he's saying he wants me to do this documentary. I was like, wow, I have made it. You know what I mean? He's going to bankroll this. And David was such a complicated, wild, incredible character. The idea that he would pay money to essentially create a piece of performance art of a documentary crew showing up at Herman's house to lavish him with this attention, to show him that he was worth that in his last final days, is incredible and so Milchian in its pure theater and conceptual absurdity. And yet what I love about Flipside is that we got to redeem the Herman footage, and then there's this moment where we go and talk to Milch, and we're doing the same thing to Milch that Milch had us do to Herman Leonard, which is we are at this assisted living facility and he is enjoying our attention. And it was a nice day that we spent with him. And I think he liked being the subject of an interview. And I think that we were seeing him, and that's what his wife Rita says so beautifully. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
So that was a very meaningful closed circuit of Flipside, to be able to take that footage of Herman and Herman's family. I think at one point was like, aren't you going to go out and make an American Masters about our dad, Herman Leonard? And I was like, I don't have the footage. I don't have the film. But to be able to kind of have Herman carry this film in an unexpected way has been really meaningful for his daughter and her husband, who oversee his archive. So doing that and following through on that has been, finishing this film is just, again, that was the breakthrough for me. It's just the finishing. I can have ideas about documentaries for into infinity, but that does not mean that you're making and completing them and putting them in the world. And so for you to even have seen it is just very meaningful. You know what I mean? And that's been the big breakthrough.
Great, thanks. And for our final question from Jim.
Since we're over time, I'll be very brief. Very thought-provoking film. This film seems to be very much the creation of the relationship that you both have. I don't know that this film would be the same if you didn't have this relationship. I'm not even sure what I'm asking about that, but can you two speak to that?
It's an interesting question, because I did attempt to do chunks of Flipside with other editors. And part of the problem, as Joe pointed out, was I would ask a commercial editor, I'd say, oh, can we steal a week at the end of the month? And they'd give me that week, but this was not a 1 week film. This was a film you had to give over to and give into and figure out. It was a math problem that needed figuring out. And there was no timeline for how long that was going to take. And so I feel like the most pure expression of the friendship, of the relationship, of the duration of the time that I've known him, is that he gave over to seeing it to completion. There was no money. He was not salaried. In fact, his company, Joe's company, put money into this to pay assistant editors and for hard drives. And I still feel bad that he has not redeemed that money, but I'm hoping there are other rewards in him having worked on this film. So I feel like the relationship is embodied in the faith that he had in following, in giving over to trying this, because this film was not assured of its completion. He gave over when he saw a very small amount of footage. It was essentially the Uncle Floyd thing that kind of got him hooked. But it was in his faith in me and in some other things we'd done that allowed him to follow through. And I think that is a reflection of the friendship and the relationship. That I don't know. No, I don't think many other editors or producers or people would have had that commitment.
Yeah, I mean, there were weird things where I was able to say, like, that's not how it happened. And remember when this, and like, remember when Ira would be falling asleep in a meeting. Yes. And so we had like those little things because we had shared experiences.
It was fact checking.
Yeah, I do think there was like with Claire who did such a great job, but she's young and hasn't been punished by life and doesn't have a family, and so that is something that I was able to bring to it as well, is that, because when you have kids, there's just a completely different relationship to your work that I think is a part of the film in a major way. But yeah, I don't know. There was that shorthand I think was very helpful.
So, final question, Joe, is your company looking to get behind any other documentary projects at the moment?
I mean, yeah, I mean the fascinating thing about this little post-production company that we built is we discovered that we actually make profit just through the efficiencies, and so we funnel all that money into a development fund. So we're trying to make more of our own projects. I have a film that we're completing right now, which hopefully will see the light of day. There's a young filmmaker that we know, and I mentioned I partnered her with my AE, and they're cutting her film, and they're almost done with that. So I think the benefit of having a company like an infrastructure to do things is that we're able to support other people, bring younger editors on, give them opportunities like a Claire, like some other people. So yeah, we're trying to do as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. Now that you're the latest D-Word member, folks can get in touch with you because in the member database, we have contact information.
And if you Google me, you can find
brace yourself. Brace yourself.
Well, I'm booked.
We're out of time. Thank you guys both for coming.
Doug, thank you so much for having us. And the level of detail and the interest and the specificity of making a documentary film that you and your audience have brought to this is incredible. These are not the conversations we had in the publicity part of it. It was, what does Uncle Floyd think of it? And all those questions are fine, but this was very satisfyingly and fun and about the making of an actual documentary, like how it gets made, the sort of nuts and bolts. Thank you.
Well, thank you. What does Uncle Floyd feel about it?
Well, I don't have happy news to report, which is Uncle Floyd has had some health issues. Unfortunately, it's one of those moments where I feel like we got a version of Uncle Floyd on the film that I feel like is maybe not where he's at right now. And I feel very lucky that we captured that version of Floyd. But I know through his family, who I'm in touch with, that he's doing okay. He saw it. He got a kick out of it. But it's, again, one of those documentary things. I will tell one last story. So this is the thing about documentary. You have to act on your instincts as quickly as possible. So at one point, I said to myself, a fucking great ending for this film would be David Bowie and Uncle Floyd doing a duet of Slip Away together at Flipside. This is when David Bowie was alive. And so through 10 different people I knew, I somehow found somebody who was in the management company of David Bowie. And I wrote an impassioned email saying, Uncle Floyd, Flipside, this movie I'm working on. And shockingly, the guy wrote back to me and he said, David loves Uncle Floyd. This sounds like a really interesting project, but David's not doing anything publicly right now. And it was a pretty oblique email, but they wrote back. And within probably 6 or 8 weeks later, it was announced that David Bowie was dead. And I think, to me, had I thought of that idea sooner, had I somehow acted on it more quickly, because, it took a long time to figure out how to contact anyone related to David Bowie, but it's one of those documentary things that, like, you gotta do these things because stuff disappears, people pass away, the ideas kind of evaporate. So I guess we'll end on make that film, act on those instincts, try to follow through.
Don't ask permission, you just have to do it. That's
Yeah. Well, thank you both for being here. Before you leave, I recommend you I don't know if you have your chat open, but I recommend you save the chat because there's a lot of appreciation being expressed for you guys in there.
Oh, thank you.
It's open up there. You can save it at the top or bottom. There's 3 dots, and save chat will pop up.
Yeah, and people, please reach out. I mean, again, we're accessible via direct message. I'm on Instagram. If anyone wants to chat about anything, I'm around. So
And as you know, this is a film that's really dependent on word of mouth. So please let everybody know where it can be seen. We put a link in the chat to the oscilloscope site, so it should be there. I don't
Yeah,
have.
it's currently streaming. It's VOD, so it's one of those, you know, 3.99ers. It's on Amazon, it's on Apple TV. You can finally stream it. So it's video on demand. So
Right.
please tell people, and if you know, you'd be helping us try to get out of the red.
Right. And yeah, and prepare for the DVD extra coming soon.
Yes, coming soon.
Coming soon.
Play that in your toaster.
Yes, maybe it'll be a stocking stuffer by Christmas if we can. How's that for a deadline? All right, guys. Thanks again so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Really,
We really appreciate it.
really appreciate it.